Hey guys, today we begin with whispers from the morgues of history, tracing how grave robbers, wartime doctors, and covert Cold War chemists crossed the line between curiosity and cruelty. We'll linger in icy Nazi chambers, creep through Unit 731's plague-soaked corridors, and watch the CIA slip LSD into unsuspecting cups each chapter, showing how ethical firewalls were hammered out in the darkest places. As the tale unfolds, soft candlelight will guide us toward the hard-won principles that now guard every medical consent form. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, put your phone or TV remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. There's something about the flicker of a candle in the darkness that draws us towards stories we perhaps shouldn't hear. Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of history's shadowlands. As the night embraces us both, I'll guide you through tales of science untethered from compassion, of curiosity divorced from conscience. The experiments I'm about to describe truly happened, each one casting a long shadow across the landscape of human knowledge. But you need not fear. My voice will remain steady, a companion through these darkened corridors, and when our journey ends, you'll rest easier for having faced these specters with open eyes. I speak these words not to disturb your descent into slumber, but to honor those whose suffering purchase lessons we must never forget. Sometimes understanding darkness helps us better appreciate the light. So settle in, adjust your pillow, and know that as troubling as these stories may be, they've already transpired. The past cannot reach through time to harm you here. The human form has always captivated us. Its intricate machinery, its resilient architecture, its mysterious boundaries between life and death. But knowledge of our bodily secrets wasn't easily won. Long before ethics committees and informed consent, the veil between medical progress and moral transgression was gossamer thin. In the gaslit streets of Victorian London, a peculiar commerce flourished in the midnight hours. The resurrection men, grave robbers paid by medical schools to exhume the recently deceased, plied their grim trade with shovels muffled in cloth. Anatomy, you see, required specimens, and the legal supply couldn't match academic demand. Bodies of the poor, often still wrapped in their burial shrouds, would arrive at dissection theatres by dawn, where eager students awaited with scalpel in hand. The most notorious of these body snatchers were William Burke and William Hare, who in 1828 Edinburgh decided that waiting for natural deaths was inefficient. Instead, they murdered 16 people, suffocating them in a way that left no marks, before selling the pristine corpses to Dr. Robert Knox, an anatomy lecturer who asked suspiciously few questions. When their crimes were discovered, public horror was matched only by macabre fascination. After Burke's execution, his body was publicly dissected, a fate he had inflicted on so many others. These boundary crossings weren't merely criminal, they reflected a societal calculus. The advancement of medicine, it was quietly decided, outweighed individual dignity in death. Anatomists sketched and cut, catalogued and preserved, building knowledge upon anonymous bodies that had never consented to become textbooks of flesh. As the century turned and electric bulbs replaced gas lamps, science accelerated its march. Human experimentation continued in quieter ways, testing new surgical techniques on charity hospital patients, observing disease progression without intervention, using orphanage children for vaccine trials. The vulnerable became the vanguards of medical progress, often without knowledge or choice. The 20th century dawned with promise, germ theory understood, anesthesia refined, public health emerging as a discipline. Yet the widening river of scientific progress was about to spill its banks, flooding the century with horrors that would forever alter our understanding of what humans might do in pursuit of knowledge. As twilight settled over Europe in the 1930s, shadows lengthened into what would become the darkest chapter in modern scientific history. The rise of Nazi Germany brought with it not just political terror, but the perversion of medicine on an industrial scale. Here was science untethered from its moorings in compassion, drifting into ideological waters so poisonous they still contaminate our nightmares. It began innocuously enough. with theories of racial hygiene that had found fertile soil in many Western nations. But in Germany, these ideas metastasized under a regime that valued some lives as intrinsically superior to others. By 1939, the T4 euthanasia program had begun targeting those with disabilities, deemed life unworthy of life. For German physicians, the ethical bright line between healing and harming had already been crossed. When concentration camps filled with those deemed racially inferior or politically dangerous, some doctors saw not human suffering but unprecedented research opportunities. Captive populations, stripped of rights and dignity, became living laboratories. No review boards restricted their methods, no consent forms required signatures, no ethical constraints limited their curiosity. At Auschwitz, Dr. Josef Mengele earned his infamous sobriquet Angel of Death through his obsession with human genetics and twins. Children would awaken to his gloved finger beckoning, selecting them from morning roll call for studies that bore little resemblance to legitimate science. Twins particularly fascinated him, nature's controlled experiment. He would measure them exhaustively, inject their eyes with dyes to see if he could change their color, draw their blood until they fainted, and ultimately, many would face synchronous death so their organs could be compared side by side. Alongside Mengele's genetic obsessions, other camps hosted experiments of equal cruelty but greater practical intent. At Dachau, physicians subjected prisoners to high-altitude conditions in decompression chambers, ostensibly to help Luftwaffe pilots survive when shot down. Subjects would convulse, bleed from ears and eyes, and ultimately die as their lungs ruptured. The doctors meticulously recorded every moment of suffering, every physiological change, as the air thinned and consciousness faded. Winter brought hypothermia experiments. Prisoners were forced into ice water or left naked in sub-zero temperatures for hours, while doctors monitored their core temperature's slow decline. Some were then rewarmed, using different methods, from hot baths to the body heat of other prisoners, to determine the most effective rescue techniques. Many did not survive this forced winter. Those who did often suffered permanent tissue damage from frostbite, so severe their blackened limbs required amputation. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, Polish prisoners called rabbits endured excruciating surgical experiments. Nazi doctors deliberately wounded their legs, introducing wood shavings, glass fragments, and bacteria to mimic battlefield injuries. They then tested sulfonamide drugs, cutting into muscle and bone, removing healthy tissue, and breaking limbs that were then left untreated. The women's screams echoed through the camp barracks at night. Seawater experiments sought ways for shipwrecked sailors to survive without fresh water. Prisoners were forced to drink only chemically altered seawater until they experienced extreme dehydration. Their parched lips cracked and bled as doctors noted the progression of kidney failure and delirium. At Buchenwald, an experimental station tested the efficacy of anti-typhus vaccines on prisoners deliberately infected with the disease. In other blocks, phosphorus was applied to skin to test treatments for incendiary bomb wounds. The burns were excruciating, the treatments largely ineffective, the documentation meticulous. When Allied forces finally breached camp gates in 1945, medical officers stood stunned before evidence too methodical to dismiss as mere sadism. Here was data recorded in the dispassionate language of science: charts, graphs, photographs, preserved specimens. The experimenters had considered themselves researchers, not torturers. They had pursued knowledge with absolute detachment from the humanity of their subjects. In the aftermath, 23 physicians and administrators stood trial at Nuremberg, specifically for medical crimes. 7 were hanged, others imprisoned. But perhaps more significant than the verdicts was the document that emerged from these proceedings: the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles establishing voluntary consent as absolutely essential, along with protections for research subjects. This slender scaffold of ethics, drafted in direct response to atrocity, would become the foundation upon which all modern medical research ethics now rest. Yet for thousands of victims, justice came too late. Their suffering had purchased ethical boundaries written in their blood. The silence that followed, the decades of reluctance to speak openly about what transpired in those medical blocks, reflects both respect for victims and uncomfortable recognition of how easily science unmoored from ethics becomes not enlightenment but abomination. As Western eyes focused on the exposed horrors of Nazi experimentation, another chapter of medical atrocity remained largely hidden, shrouded in classified documents and diplomatic necessity. Far to the east, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, an equally nightmarish program operated behind the innocuous name Unit 731. The architect of this horror was Dr. Shiro Ishii, a charismatic microbiologist whose ambition matched his scientific brilliance. Whereas Nazi doctors often justified their work through racial ideology, Ishii's motivations seemed more pragmatic. He sought biological weapons that could secure Japanese military dominance. Beginning in 1935, he constructed an elaborate compound near Harbin, China, that locals came to call the Square of Death. Inside this facility, prisoners, primarily Chinese, but also Korean, Russian, and Allied POWs, were reduced to the dehumanizing designation Maruta, meaning logs. The term originated from the facility's cover story as a lumber mill, but took on grotesque significance. These human logs were systematically processed through experiments designed with cold precision. The scope of Unit 731's program stretched beyond anything seen in Europe. Vivisections, surgical procedures conducted on fully conscious, unanesthetized prisoners, were routine. Doctors removed organs one by one to chart the progress of death, sometimes reattaching them to observe regenerative processes. Limbs were amputated and reattached to opposite sides of the body, in crude attempts at transplantation science. Subjects were infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and syphilis, then dissected to observe disease progression through different organs. In outdoor testing stations, prisoners were tied to stakes as researchers dropped plague-infected fleas upon them, meticulously recording which delivery methods proved most effective. Others were marched into freezing fields where they stood immobile until frostbite claimed their extremities, their frozen limbs then struck with hammers to observe how they shattered like glass. Some were placed in pressure chambers until their eyes bulged and blood seeped from every orifice. Others were slowly roasted or electrocuted while researchers measured their endurance thresholds. Perhaps most chilling were the field tests. Ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas were dropped on Chinese villages to evaluate the effectiveness of biological warfare in real conditions. Typhoid was introduced into water supplies. Wells were poisoned with cholera. Ishii's men carefully documented infection rates and casualty counts, creating data models for larger attacks. Conservative estimates suggest at least 3-0 died directly in Unit 731 experiments, while tens of thousands more perished in field trials across China, civilians who never knew they were research subjects. When the war ended in 1945, Unit 731's researchers expected to face tribunals similar to those at Nuremberg. Instead, a strange silence fell. American military intelligence, recognizing the scientific value of data, too unethical to gather themselves, struck a deal. In exchange for detailed records of their experiments, Dr. Ishii and his core team received immunity from prosecution. While Nazi doctors hanged, Japanese researchers quietly resumed academic careers in post-war Japan. This Faustian bargain meant that victims of Unit 731 received neither acknowledgement nor justice for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s that historical records began to surface through declassified documents and survivor testimonies. China has since built a museum at the Unit 731 site, preserving rusted equipment and laboratory remnants as testaments to atrocities once denied. Yet compared to the Holocaust's place in collective memory, these horrors remain disproportionately forgotten. Perhaps most disturbing is how the voices of victims have been erased twice over, first through their dehumanization as research subjects, then through historical amnesia. The Chinese farmers who watched plague decimate their villages never understood they were experimental subjects. The prisoners who died on dissection tables were buried in mass graves, their names unrecorded. In the quiet spaces between historical paragraphs, thousands of untold stories whisper from shadows. This erasure speaks to a broader pattern: scientific atrocities committed against those deemed other, racially, politically, geographically distant from centers of power, often fade from historical consciousness. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps offer a moment's remembrance to these forgotten subjects, whose suffering remains largely uncommemorated in the marble halls of medical progress. While Unit 731's horrors unfolded across the Pacific, a very different experiment began in Alabama, one that would continue for 40 years, becoming America's longest-running non-therapeutic clinical study. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service recruited 600 black men from Macon County to study the natural progression of syphilis. The subjects, 399 with latent syphilis and 201 without as controls, were never told they had the disease. Instead, researchers informed them they were being treated for bad blood, a local term encompassing various ailments. The study was initially planned for 6 months but continued for decades. By 1947, penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis, yet researchers deliberately withheld this information and medicine from the men. Local physicians were asked not to treat them. Draft boards were requested not to call infected men to service where they might receive treatment. The men underwent painful spinal taps, presented as special free treatments, that were actually diagnostic procedures to track nerve damage from untreated syphilis. The rural setting of Macon County proved ideal for researchers. Educational opportunities were limited, medical knowledge sparse, and the promise of free meals, medical exams, and burial insurance sufficient incentive for impoverished sharecroppers to participate. Nurse Eunice Rivers, herself African American, served as the crucial liaison between subjects and scientists, building trust that facilitated the study's continuation. Year after year, the men returned for examinations. They watched their bodies deteriorate, suffering blindness, deafness, mental illness, heart disease. Some infected their wives, who bore children with congenital syphilis. All the while, government physicians carefully documented their decline, authoring multiple papers in medical journals without ethical qualms. It wasn't until 1972 that Peter Buxton, a PHS venereal disease investigator, leaked the study's details to the Associated Press. The resulting public outcry finally ended the experiment. The next year, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the subjects, resulting in a $10 million settlement and lifetime medical benefits for surviving participants and infected family members. By then, at least 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 more from related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The last study participant died in 2004, but the experiment's legacy continues to shape medical ethics and cultural memory. It took until 1997 for President Clinton to offer a formal apology, stating, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong, clearly racist." Today, the study's legacy lingers in persistent distrust of medical institutions among many African Americans, a rational response to historical betrayal that continues to affect public health outcomes. As Tuskegee subjects suffered in plain sight, another set of experiments unfolded in shadows so deep that many records were later destroyed to ensure secrecy. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles authorized Project MK-Ultra, a covert program exploring mind control techniques amid Cold War paranoia about brainwashing. Under the direction of chemist Sidney Gottlieb, the program encompassed at least 149 sub-projects across 80 institutions, including prestigious universities, hospitals, and prisons. The experiments shared a common thread: understanding how to control human behavior through chemical, biological, and psychological manipulation. The most notorious substance tested was lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, then a little-known compound. CIA operatives administered the powerful hallucinogen to unwitting subjects to observe its disorienting effects. Army scientist Dr. Frank Olson, exposed to LSD without his knowledge during a 1953 retreat, suffered severe psychological distress and died days later in a fall from a hotel window, officially ruled a suicide but questioned by his family for decades. In Operation Midnight Climax, the agency established brothels in San Francisco and New York, where prostitutes lured clients who were secretly dosed with LSD while operatives observed through one-way mirrors. The men, who never consented and never knew they were subjects, experienced psychedelic effects while under surveillance, their reactions meticulously documented. Other MKUltra experiments included sensory deprivation, psychological torture, electroshock therapy, and hypnosis. Vulnerable populations were disproportionately targeted: mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and sex workers, people whose complaints would likely be dismissed if experiments went awry. The full scope of MKUltra will never be known. In 1973, upon learning of upcoming congressional investigations, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all program records destroyed. Only a cache of financial documents accidentally stored elsewhere survived, providing glimpses into the program's breadth. These fragments reached public consciousness through Senate hearings in 1975, led by Senator Frank Church. The hearings revealed not just MKUltra but numerous intelligence overreaches, sparking reforms and oversight mechanisms. Yet the most disturbing question lingers unanswered in ethical twilight. How many unwitting subjects lived their lives, never understanding the source of their psychological distress, never knowing they had been, however briefly, laboratory subjects in a program that viewed their minds as acceptable collateral damage in a shadow war? While government agencies operated in shadows, academic psychologists conducted equally troubling experiments under laboratory lights. Two studies in particular have become infamous, not just for their ethics, but for what they revealed about human nature, our remarkable capacity to harm others when directed by authority. In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram designed an elegantly simple experiment in response to a profound question: could the Holocaust have happened in America? Were Nazi atrocities the product of a uniquely German obedience to authority, or did this potential lurk within ordinary people everywhere? His experiment would provide a disturbing answer. Participants arrived at the Yale laboratory, believing they were assisting in a study on memory and learning. They were assigned the role of teacher and introduced to a learner, actually an actor, who was strapped into an apparatus in an adjacent room. The teacher was instructed to administer increasingly powerful electric shocks to the learner whenever they answered questions incorrectly. A stern experimenter in a lab coat supervised the process. No actual shocks were delivered, but participants heard pre-recorded sounds of distress, escalating from uncomfortable groans to agonized screams, and finally ominous silence. If the participant hesitated, the experimenter would calmly direct them to continue with phrases like, "The experiment requires that you continue," or "You have no other choice." Milgram had consulted psychiatrists before beginning, who predicted only about 1% of participants, those with sadistic tendencies, would administer the maximum 450-volt shock. The actual results were staggering. 65% of participants continued to the highest level, despite visible distress and moral qualms. Most exhibited signs of extreme tension, sweating, trembling, nervous laughter, yet continued to obey. When Milgram published his findings, public reaction was immediate and heated. Some praised the study for illuminating dangerous psychological mechanisms. Others condemned it for deceiving participants and causing emotional distress. Milgram himself reflected that the study revealed how easily ordinary people could become agents in a terrible destructive process, concluding that relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. A decade later, in 1971, Stanford psychology professor Philip Zimbardo constructed an even more immersive study of institutional power. In the basement of the university's psychology building, he created a mock prison and randomly assigned student volunteers to roles as either guards or prisoners. The 2-week experiment collapsed after just 6 days. as the simulation became frighteningly real. Guards, instructed simply to maintain order without using physical violence, quickly adopted authoritarian tactics. They stripped prisoners of individuality by assigning numbers instead of names, forced them to wear degrading uniforms, and devised creative humiliations, from repetitive counting exercises to cleaning toilet bowls with bare hands. Some guards showed particular cruelty during night shifts when they believed cameras weren't recording. Prisoners initially resisted but soon displayed passive acceptance. Several experienced such emotional distress that they were released early. One developed a psychosomatic rash covering his body. Another staged a hunger strike and was placed in solitary confinement, a closet dubbed the Hole. Most disturbing was how rapidly all participants embraced their assigned roles, forgetting the artificial nature of the experiment. Zimbardo himself became consumed by his role as prison superintendent, focusing on maintaining the institution rather than monitoring participant welfare. It took the objections of Christina Maslach, a graduate student who would later become Zimbardo's wife, to break the spell. Upon visiting the experiment, she was horrified by the guards' treatment of prisoners and confronted Zimbardo about his ethical blindness. Both experiments, now staples of introductory psychology textbooks, continue to spark debate. Critics note methodological concerns. Milgram may have pressured participants more than his published protocols suggested, while Zimbardo's guards received subtle cues about expected behavior. Yet their broader implications about conformity, institutional power, and moral disengagement remain disturbingly relevant. Perhaps their most valuable lesson is the simplest. The capacity for cruelty exists not in some distant other, but within ordinary people, students, neighbors, ourselves. This recognition doesn't excuse harmful actions but invites vigilance, reminding us that empathy requires ongoing moral attention rather than comfortable assumptions about our inherent goodness. As dawn's first light emerged after the long night of unethical experimentation, medical and scientific communities gradually established ethical frameworks to prevent future abuses. This process wasn't immediate but evolved through incremental whispers of conscience, each new guideline prompted by revealed atrocities, each regulatory structure built upon failures that preceded it. The 1947 Nuremberg Code represented the first international document to explicitly require voluntary consent for human subjects. Its 10 principles, while groundbreaking, lacked enforcement mechanisms and primarily addressed the most egregious violations. Many researchers still viewed it as addressing Nazi extremes rather than everyday research practices. 17 years later, the Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, expanded these principles specifically for medical research. It distinguished between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research, emphasized that patient welfare should always take precedence over scientific interests, and introduced the concept of independent committee review. Yet these international codes often remained abstract until scandals brought their necessity home. In America, public revelations about Tuskegee and other controversial studies created momentum for institutional reforms. The 1974 National Research Act established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which began the arduous task of developing comprehensive guidelines. Their work culminated in the 1979 Belmont Report, which articulated 3 fundamental principles: respect for persons, recognizing individual autonomy; beneficence, maximizing benefits while minimizing harms; and justice, distributing research benefits and burdens fairly. These principles, seemingly obvious in retrospect, represented a revolutionary shift from viewing research subjects as means to treating them as ends in themselves. Practically, these ethical whispers manifested in the creation of institutional review boards, IRBs, committees of scientists and community members who must approve research protocols before studies commence. Today, researchers drafting consent forms, designing recruitment strategies, or planning data security measures navigate requirements unimaginable to their predecessors. The consent form, once a cursory document if used at all, has expanded into comprehensive explanation of procedures, risks, benefits, and alternatives. Language must be accessible to participants without scientific backgrounds. Vulnerable populations receive special protections. Data confidentiality requires robust safeguards. The entire research enterprise now operates within ethical boundaries that, while sometimes bureaucratically cumbersome, shelter human dignity from utilitarian calculation. Yet, for all these structural safeguards, ethics remains a living conversation rather than a settled matter. New technologies, from genetic manipulation to artificial intelligence, continually present novel questions. The distance between Nuremberg and Helsinki, between Tuskegee's revelation and the Belmont Report, reminds us that ethical awareness evolves through collective vigilance rather than sudden illumination. Perhaps most importantly, these protections acknowledge a fundamental tension in scientific progress, the delicate balance between advancing knowledge and preserving human dignity. In the quiet spaces between laboratory procedures, this tension remains unresolved but consciously attended to, a hushed reckoning with our capacity for both wonder and transgression. As our candle burns lower, casting longer shadows across these historical remembrances, we arrive at perhaps the most important reflection. What lingering lessons whisper from these darkened corridors of scientific history? What quiet wisdom might we carry forward from these difficult accounts? First, perhaps, is the recognition that moral distance enables harm. In each case we've explored, experimenters created psychological separation between themselves and their subjects. Nazi doctors spoke of specimens rather than people. Unit 730, one researchers called prisoners' logs. Tuskegee physicians viewed sharecroppers as data points in a natural history of disease. MK-Ultra operatives considered unwitting subjects as necessary sacrifices for national security. This distancing, whether through language, ideology, or institutional structures, allowed intelligent, educated individuals to participate in acts they would likely have condemned in other contexts. This psychological mechanism operates not just in extreme cases, but in subtle, everyday interactions. Whenever we categorize others as fundamentally different from ourselves, whether by race, nationality, belief, or status, we begin the cognitive process that can ultimately justify mistreatment. The antidote lies in deliberate recognition of shared humanity, in crossing the artificial distances our minds so readily construct. A second lesson murmurs from these shadows. Scientific progress, divorced from ethical constraint, becomes monstrous rather than enlightening. The knowledge gained through these experiments came at unconscionable cost. Some findings, like those from hypothermia studies, have been cautiously incorporated into medical practice, raising uncomfortable questions about benefiting from ill-gotten data. Other experimental programs, particularly MK-Ultra's more extreme efforts, yielded little of scientific value despite tremendous human suffering. Progress without ethical foundation ultimately undermines itself, producing not wisdom but distortion. Perhaps most disquieting is how ordinary these transgressions became within their contexts. Few perpetrators considered themselves villains. Most believed their actions served some greater good, advancing medicine, securing national interests, understanding human behavior. Evil rarely announces itself with dramatic flair. Instead, it emerges through incremental acceptance of questionable practices, through silent complicity, through rationalization of means by intended ends. This ordinariness serves as both warning and invitation, warning that ethical vigilance requires constant attention rather than occasional consideration. Invitation to recognize our own capacity for moral blindness in service to goals we value. The boundary between conscientious researcher and perpetrator is not fixed but permeable, maintained through ongoing ethical reflection rather than presumed immunity to corruption. What guards this boundary? Not merely formal codes, though these provide essential scaffolding, but communities of conscience. Christina Maslach challenging Zimbardo's absorption in the Stanford experiment. Peter Buxton refusing to remain silent about Tuskegee. The physicians who objected to Nazi research protocols, often facing professional ostracism or worse. Whistleblowers who revealed MK-Ultra decades later. These individual voices, raised despite institutional pressure, represent ethical courage worth honoring. They remind us that ethical progress doesn't advance solely through grand declarations, but through quiet moments of individual conscience. The uncomfortable question raised in a research meeting, the protocol modification that prioritizes subject welfare over data completeness, the refusal to remain silent when witnessing questionable practices. Like candle flames in darkness, these small acts of ethical courage illuminate paths forward. History's darkest scientific chapters also reveal something profound about memory itself. Remembering these events, uncomfortable though such remembrance may be, serves as prophylactic against repetition. The experiments we've explored tonight weren't conducted by distant strangers, but by individuals with training, credentials, and institutional backing similar to researchers working today. Their transgressions remind us that scientific progress requires not just intellectual brilliance, but moral attention. The candle flame of vigilance requires fuel, not the burning heat of outrage, which flares and fades, but the steady warmth of communal remembrance. We study these chapters not to kindle hatred toward perpetrators, but to recognize patterns that emerge when ethical boundaries blur. We remember victims not as abstract data points, but as individuals whose suffering purchased protective boundaries we now take for granted. Perhaps that's why these stories, troubling as they are, serve a purpose beyond historical documentation. They become ethical parables, not abstract philosophical thought experiments, but real events whose contours guide present choices. They remind us that progress without compassion becomes perversion, that knowledge without conscience leads not to enlightenment but to shadow. As our candle burns toward its final flicker, these historical shadows begin to recede. You've journeyed through difficult terrain tonight, bearing witness to painful chapters of scientific history. Yet this witnessing itself represents a form of ethical participation, an acknowledgement that remembering honors those who suffered and helps protect future potential subjects from similar fates. The room grows quieter now. Outside, perhaps, rain gently taps against window panes, or night branches sway in soft breezes. The weight of these histories begins to lift as we approach our conclusion, not because we dismiss their significance, but because we've carried them consciously with respect for both victims and for truth. In these final moments together, let your breath deepen and slow. Feel the comfort of your resting place, the pillow supporting your head, the blanket's gentle weight, the darkness behind your eyelids gradually expanding. Scientific progress continues its march, but with ethical guardrails strengthened by historical remembrance, you need not keep vigil tonight. For now, allow yourself to release these difficult stories. They have been acknowledged, these experimenters and subjects, these moral transgressions and ethical corrections. History's vigilant historians continue their documentation. Ethics committees meet in fluorescent-lit conference rooms. Researchers complete required training before designing studies. The structures of protection, built upon painful lessons, stand guard while you rest. As consciousness begins its gentle drift towards sleep, know that bearing witness, even to difficult truths, strengthens rather than diminishes our humanity. These shadows, once faced, hold less power to disturb. You've honored both victims and ethical progress through your attentive listening. Now, as my voice grows softer, let yourself sink deeper into restfulness. The candle flame gutters, casting one final gentle glow before darkness embraces the room. Sleep approaches with open arms, offering restoration and peace. Tomorrow brings new light, new choices, new opportunities for compassionate action. But tonight, dear listener, you have earned your rest. Let your eyes remain closed, your breathing settled into its natural rhythm. The weight of history lifts from your shoulders as sleep's gentle tide rises to meet you. Rest well, knowing that in remembering difficult truths, you've participated in the ongoing conversation between knowledge and conscience, between progress and protection. Sleep now, while history's guardians keep their watch. Good night, dear listener. Good night. As dusk settles over the mountains of Kyoto, imagine yourself seated upon woven tatami, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. Outside, evening birds call their gentle good nights, while inside, a cast-iron kettle whispers steam into the cooling air. We've traveled back to 16th century Japan, to a small, unassuming tea hut where a revolution of aesthetic simplicity is quietly changing the cultural landscape. Tonight, we sit with tea master Senno Rikyu, whose humble ceremonies would influence art, architecture, and philosophy for centuries to come. Long before Rikyu's time, tea found its way to Japan through Buddhist monks returning from China. In the 9th century, Emperor Saga developed a fondness for the brew, but it remained largely medicinal, a stimulant for long meditation sessions in mountain temples. The powdered form we know as matcha arrived centuries later, carried by the monk Isai around 1191. In those early days, tea gatherings were boisterous affairs among nobility, competitions of extravagance where rare Chinese tea utensils were displayed and admired like precious jewels. The seeds of change were planted in the 14th century, when Zen priest Murata Juko began introducing rustic Japanese elements alongside the prized Chinese implements. He brought the ceremony closer to Zen principles, finding beauty in imperfection, value in simplicity, meaning in transience. The ceremony began its transformation from showcase to spiritual practice, from entertainment to meditation. By the time Rikyu was born in 1522 to a wealthy merchant family in the port city of Sakai, tea had become intertwined with the cultural elite. His journey began at 13, studying under tea master Kitamuki Dochin. Later, he would train with the renowned Takeno-ju, who emphasized the concept of wabi, an aesthetic of austere beauty, of finding profound meaning in the simple, the weathered, the imperfect. Imagine young Rikyu kneeling before his teacher, observing how water is ladled from wooden bucket to iron kettle, how each movement contains both purpose and emptiness. In those quiet hours, something awakened in him, a recognition that the most profound expressions of beauty required no ornamentation, that true sophistication lay in restraint rather than display. The monasteries where tea was first sipped in meditation held a particular atmosphere: cool stone floors, mountain air filtering through bamboo groves, the distant sound of wood being chopped for temple fires. Rikyu absorbed these sensations, understanding that environment shapes experience, that the vessel matters as much as what it contains. As the kettle continues its gentle song, notice how the steam rises and dissipates, never the same shape twice, yet always following the same journey from water to air. This transformation, this impermanence, lies at the heart of the tea ceremony Rikyu would perfect. Each gathering happens once and can never be replicated. Each moment exists to be appreciated precisely because it cannot last. In the crowded merchant city of Sakai, where ships arrived laden with foreign treasures and the clamor of commerce filled narrow streets, Rikyu created spaces of profound quiet. As his mastery grew, he moved away from the ornate Chinese aesthetics that dominated tea culture. Where others sought rare porcelains glazed in celestial blues, Rikyu turned to local potters creating humble wares with uneven glazes and natural imperfections. This was the embodiment of wabi-sabi, an aesthetic that sees beauty in asymmetry, roughness and simplicity, a weathered tea bowl bearing the marks of its creator's hands, an irregularly shaped bamboo tea scoop cut from a garden stalk, a rusted iron kettle more valued for its patina than any shine. These became the touchstones of Rikyu's approach, each object selected not for perfection but for character, not for status but for sincerity. Picture Rikyu in his most famous tea room, the Taian, a space measuring merely 2 tatami mats about 6 feet square. Though he was by then tea master to the most powerful warlord in Japan, he chose extreme minimalism. The entrance was deliberately small, requiring all guests, regardless of status, to bow deeply, to humble themselves before entering the sacred space of tea. Inside, only essential items were present. A single scroll hanging in the tokonoma alcove, a simple flower arrangement, perhaps just one blossom in a bamboo vase, the hearth, sunken into the floor, from which the kettle gently sings. The tea room thus became a sanctuary from hierarchy, from worldly concerns, from the very concepts of status and power that dominated 16th century Japan. Samurai removed their swords before entering. Merchants set aside thoughts of profit. All participants became equals in the democratic space of the tea hut, where the only authority was the ceremony itself. Each movement in Rikyu's tea room was choreographed yet natural, practiced yet spontaneous. The folding of the fukusa cloth used to purify utensils. The precise angle at which the bamboo ladle rests across the kettle. The deliberate turn of the tea bowl to present its most appealing side to the guest. These gestures, refined over thousands of hours of practice, achieve a quality the Japanese call yugen, a profound grace so deeply internalized it appears effortless. In the tumultuous Sengoku period, as warlords battled for control of a fractured Japan, tea became an unexpected arena of political influence. The ceremony's growing cultural significance drew the attention of the country's most powerful figures, particularly Oda Nobunaga, the first great unifier of Japan. Recognizing tea's social currency, Nobunaga collected utensils as symbols of power, sometimes confiscating prized items from defeated enemies. In this climate, where tea bowls could be valued more highly than castle towers, Rikyu's aesthetic approach became quietly subversive. Nobunaga appointed Rikyu as one of his principal tea masters around 1578, acknowledging his unparalleled skill. When Nobunaga was betrayed and killed in 1582, his successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of peasant origins who rose through military brilliance, maintained Rikyu's position at court. The relationship between the ambitious warlord and the contemplative tea master embodied the tension between power and philosophy that characterized the age. Hideyoshi used tea gatherings as diplomatic tools, solidifying alliances and demonstrating cultural sophistication to potential rivals. Yet, unlike Rikyu, who found beauty in weathered simplicity, Hideyoshi was drawn to ostentation. His infamous golden tea room at Fushimi Castle featured walls covered in gold leaf, with golden tatami edging and utensils fashioned from precious metals. This gilded chamber stood in stark contrast to Rikyu's humble tea huts with their earthen floors and weathered timber. Despite these differences, Hideyoshi recognized Rikyu's mastery and elevated him to unprecedented status. As Grand Tea Master, Rikyu could dictate taste throughout the realm, influencing everything from architecture to ceramics. Imagine the slender, composed tea master moving through Hideyoshi's opulent castles, a figure of restraint amid extravagance, his simple dark robes contrasting with courtiers' brocaded finery. In these politically charged environments, Rikyu performed tea with unfailing composure. Each ceremony became a temporary autonomous zone, where different rules applied, where power derived not from military might or wealth, but from mastery of form, from aesthetic judgment, from spiritual presence. While armies clashed across Japan in Rikyu's tea room, victory came through finding perfection in a single moment. The sound of water being poured, the exchange of silent bows, the contemplation of a rough-textured tea bowl held between warmed palms. For Hideyoshi, tea ceremonies provided legitimacy, cultural credentials for a man who had risen from humble origins. For Rikyu, these same ceremonies offered something more subtle, opportunities to demonstrate that true authority could exist beyond worldly power, that aesthetic principles could stand equal to political force. This philosophical tension would eventually prove fatal. As years passed, the relationship between warlord and tea master grew complex. Rikyu's influence expanded, his aesthetic philosophy touching every corner of elite culture. Some historians suggest Hideyoshi began to view the tea master's cultural authority with suspicion. Others propose that Rikyu's restraint served as an implicit criticism of Hideyoshi's excesses. The precise cause remains mysterious, but in 1591, the unthinkable occurred. Hideyoshi ordered Rikyu to commit ritual suicide. Traditional accounts suggest that Rikyu had placed a wooden statue of himself at the entrance gate of Daitokuji Temple, requiring Hideyoshi to walk beneath it, an unforgivable insult to the ruler of Japan. Others propose political machinations or court intrigues. Whatever the cause, the sentence was delivered, and in keeping with his lifelong devotion to composure and ritual propriety, Rikyu prepared for his final tea ceremony. Picture the small tea room at Rikyu's residence on that February morning in 1591. Outside, perhaps plum blossoms were just beginning to open, harbingers of spring he would not live to see. Inside, a select group of disciples gathered for one last bowl of tea with their master. The atmosphere must have been heavy with unspoken emotion, yet the ceremony itself would have proceeded with characteristic restraint, the same careful movements, the same mindful attention, the same appreciation for transient beauty that had defined Rikyu's approach. After serving tea to each guest, Rikyu is said to have given his tea items as keepsakes. To his chief disciple went his prized tea scoop, carved from aged bamboo, inscribed with its name, Namida, Tears. With formal composure, he composed his death poem. Welcome to thee, O sword of eternity. Through Buddha and through Daruma alike thou hast cleft thy way. When his guests departed, Rikyu performed the ritual of seppuku with the same deliberate grace he had brought to thousands of tea ceremonies. At 69 years old, having transformed Japanese aesthetics forever, the master of wabi-sabi embraced the ultimate impermanence. Following Rikyu's death, his disciples continued his lineage, though each added their own interpretations to his aesthetic vision. Furuta Oribe, a samurai and tea master, introduced dynamic asymmetry and bold design innovations. Kobori Enshu later developed a more balanced approach, combining Rikyu's rusticity with elements of elegance. Three schools descended directly from Rikyu's teaching: Omoto Senkei, Ura Senkei, and Mushakoji Senkei, founded by his grandson and great-grandsons, continue to practice tea ceremony to this day. Hideyoshi, perhaps regretting his decision, built a memorial tea house called Kodaiji in Kyoto just a year after ordering Rikyu's death. The warlord himself would die only 7 years later. While Hideyoshi's political achievements would eventually fade as power shifted to the Tokugawa shogunate, Rikyu's aesthetic principles have endured for over 4 centuries. In those final moments before his death, we can imagine Rikyu taking one last look at his tea room, the worn tatami, the carefully placed charcoal in the hearth, the scroll with its austere calligraphy. Each element embodied the principles to which he had dedicated his life: simplicity over ostentation, natural forms over artifice, presence over pretension. Through his death as through his life, he demonstrated that true power lies not in dominion over others but in mastery of oneself. That ordinary moments contain extraordinary depth when approached with mindfulness. As our time together draws to a close, imagine the last embers glowing in a hearth, the night crickets growing quieter outside paper walls, the moon casting shadows of bamboo across a garden path. Your breathing has perhaps already slowed to match the unhurried rhythm of our narrative journey through tea, time, and Japanese aesthetics. Allow yourself to rest in this space between wakefulness and dreams, where the steam from an iron kettle rises and dissipates like passing thoughts. There's no need to hold on to consciousness too tightly now. Like the tea master who finds beauty in impermanence, you might simply observe how awareness gently transforms into sleep's embrace. The whisper of the chishitsu, the tea room, continues even as you drift away. The ceremony of day transitioning to night, of wakefulness yielding to rest, follows its own perfect choreography. Each breath becomes a bit slower, each thought a bit less defined, as you sink deeper into the natural rhythm of your body's own ancient ritual. Sleep well, knowing that tea bowls will still exist in the morning, that somewhere water still heats in iron kettles, that the path of mindfulness remains available whenever you wish to walk it again. For now, rest in the wabi-sabi perfection of this imperfect moment, complete precisely because it cannot last. Oyasumi nasai, good night. Picture yourself in 19th century Europe, where steam engines thunder across landscapes once traversed only by horse and foot. The world is shrinking, dear listener, as innovation races forward at a pace that leaves many breathless. Telegraph wires stretch between cities like the strands of some great industrial web, while underground pneumatic tubes carry messages beneath bustling streets. It is an age of connection, of reaching across distances with unprecedented speed. Yet in the Belgian city of Liège, in the spring of 1870, communication still faces its challenges. The telegraph, marvelous though it may be, requires infrastructure, those copper lifelines that link station to station, vulnerable to weather and sabotage alike. Rural communities often find themselves isolated from this nervous system of modern commerce, waiting days for messages that urban centers exchange in minutes. In a modest government office, windows open to the spring breeze, a small committee of postal officials gathers around a table scattered with papers and half-empty teacups. They face a persistent problem. How might one deliver messages efficiently to the surrounding countryside, where telegraph lines have yet to reach and postal carriers struggle with muddy, unreliable roads? The challenge has occupied them for months, their discussions growing increasingly creative as conventional solutions prove inadequate. It is here, perhaps as someone absently strokes a cat lounging on the windowsill, that inspiration arrives in the form of a purr. One official, history has unfortunately neglected to record which specific bureaucrat deserves credit, observes how unfailingly this office mouser returns each evening, despite wandering freely throughout the day. The cat, it seems, always finds its way home. Imagine the moment of whimsical connection. Might not cats, with their mysterious homing instincts, serve as messengers? The idea, at first offered as a half-jest, begins to take root. Unlike horses, cats require no roads. Unlike carrier pigeons, already well established for aerial communication, cats can transport small parcels, not merely lightweight messages. And unlike human couriers, cats need no salary, merely the occasional treat and a warm place to sleep. Gradually, the notion transforms from flight of fancy to formal proposal. Documents are drafted with surprising sobriety, budgets calculated, logistics considered. The cat post system, as it would come to be known, begins to materialize in the spring air of Liège. We might smile now at such Victorian ingenuity, but consider the earnestness with which progress was pursued in this second industrial revolution. These were years when electricity seemed magical, when photography captured ghosts, or so some believed, when the boundary between the impossible and the merely untried seemed permeable. Why not postal cats? After all, the 19th century had already given us vacuum tube transport, underwater telegraph cables spanning oceans, and massive iron ships that somehow didn't sink. The proposal winds its way through bureaucratic channels, gathering both skepticism and enthusiasm in nearly equal measure. Eventually, a modest budget is approved, far less than requested, as is the eternal way of government funding, and the Liège cat post experiment is officially sanctioned. Communication, that increasingly vital bloodstream of modern society, might soon flow through the unlikeliest of vessels, common domestic felines transformed into civil servants with whiskers. With spring warming into early summer, the selection process begins. Not just any cat will do for this pioneering postal service. The ideal candidate must possess a strong homing instinct, a tolerant temperament, and sufficient strength to carry the specially designed waterproof message pouches. The postal officials, none with particular expertise in feline psychology, develop surprisingly detailed criteria. Local households are invited to volunteer their cats for government service, an opportunity met with a mixture of patriotic enthusiasm and bemused skepticism. Children arrive cradling beloved pets, earnestly explaining each cat's qualifications, while postal workers nod with bureaucratic gravity. Some cats arrive in baskets, others in arms, a few simply following their owners with typical feline independence. One by one, the prospective postal workers are assessed. Some hiss indignantly at the very notion of public service. Others seem promising until attempting escape through open windows. A particularly large tabby swats at the prototype message pouch with such determination that a postal worker suffers minor scratches requiring attention from a handkerchief and some sympathetic clucking from colleagues. Eventually, 37 cats are selected, a number that seems both ambitious and oddly specific. The successful candidates represent a diverse cross-section of Liège's feline population: sleek short hairs and fluffy long hairs, dignified elder cats and energetic youngsters, monochromatic tuxedos and calicos of patchwork complexity. Each receives a small collar bearing the insignia of the Belgian Postal Service, transforming ordinary mousers into official government agents. The training process reveals the optimistic nature of 19th century scientific thinking. The postal authorities developed their methodology around the observation that cats seem capable of finding their way home across considerable distances, a fact well known to any cat owner who has moved house only to have their pet reappear at the former residence days later. The theory unfolds with clockwork logic. If cats can find their way home through scent and mysterious navigational abilities, then surely they can be trained to run between two locations they consider home. Each postal cat will thus be settled in two households, one in the city, one in an outlying village, spending alternate weeks at each until both locations register in the animal's internal compass. When a message needs delivery, a cat will be released from location A, with instructions to return to location B, carrying its small waterproof pouch containing letters, small parcels, or government notices. Upon arrival and delivery, the cat would be fed, petted, and housed until needed for the return journey. Postal officials create detailed maps dividing the countryside around Liège into star-shaped delivery zones, each cat responsible for a specific route between city and countryside. The training period proceeds with mixed success. Some cats adapt quickly to their dual residences, seemingly understanding their important civic role. Others display a stubborn preference for one home over the other, requiring additional weeks of acclimatization. A few prove entirely unsuitable, refusing to cooperate despite the most patient coaching. These feline dropouts are honorably discharged from service, returning to lives of leisure, while their more adaptable colleagues continue their preparations for postal duty. By late July, with summer heat settling over the Belgian countryside, the postal authorities declare the training complete enough for initial trials. The first official cat post delivery is scheduled with considerable ceremony. Local officials gather at the Liège post office, where journalists sketch the scene for newspapers as far away as Brussels and Paris. The inaugural postal cat, a plump grey tabby named Minot, is fitted with a small waterproof pouch containing 3 letters bound for the village of Seraing, some 5 kilometers distant. Minou receives a final stroke behind the ears from the Postmaster General himself, before being released onto the cobblestone street. For a breathless moment, the cat sits perfectly still, seemingly contemplating the historical significance of the occasion. Then, with characteristic feline indifference to human expectation, Minou saunters toward a nearby alley, pauses to groom one paw, and disappears from sight. The official timer begins his count. The cat post experiment is underway. What follows might best be described as organized chaos. Throughout that long summer day, 37 cats depart the Liège post office at carefully staggered intervals, each bearing messages for different outlying communities. Officials with pocket watches record departure times in ledgers, while riders on horseback discreetly follow each feline courier to document their journeys without interference. The results prove illuminating, if not entirely encouraging. Minou, that pioneering postal tabby, does eventually arrive in Seraing, 5 hours later, having taken a circuitous route that included an extended nap in a sunny hayfield and an unsuccessful but spirited attempt to catch a sparrow. The letters arrive slightly damp but legible, as the recipient family welcomes their part-time pet with a saucer of cream and a place by the hearth. Other cats demonstrate similarly individualistic approaches to their duties. The fastest delivery comes from a sleek black cat named Noir, who completes his 3-kilometer journey to Angleur in just under 3 hours. Impressive, until one considers a human courier could walk the same distance in less than one. The longest journey stretches to nearly 24 hours, as a calico named Duchesse apparently detours to hunt mice in several barns before eventually delivering her messages. Most concerning for postal efficiency, 5 cats fail to complete their deliveries at all on this first day of service. 2 are discovered contentedly installed in homes that are neither their city nor village residences, having apparently found the accommodations and available laps superior to their assigned destinations. 1 returns to the Liège post office without its message pouch, presenting itself for duty the following morning, as if expecting fresh assignment. The remaining 2 simply vanish, though 1 will reappear weeks later, pouch still intact but empty, having seemingly enjoyed an extended rural holiday. The postal officials gather to assess these results, poring over maps where feline journeys have been traced in colored ink. The average delivery time, approximately 7 hours for distances a human might walk in 2, presents obvious logistical challenges. Yet there's something undeniably appealing about these furry messengers, whose routes follow mysterious feline logic rather than human efficiency. Despite results that might charitably be described as mixed, the Liège cat post continues its trials throughout August and into September. Adjustments are made. Lighter pouches, more consistent feeding schedules, delivery routes aligned with known cat paths rather than human roads. Gradually, delivery reliability improves, though speed remains unpredictable. The postal cats, it seems, operate on their own immutable schedules, resistant to human notions of urgency. While the practical efficacy of the cat post system might have disappointed its designers, public response proves unexpectedly enthusiastic. The notion of postal cats captures popular imagination across Belgium and beyond. Illustrated newspapers feature whimsical engravings of dignified felines wearing tiny postal uniforms, artistic license, as the actual cats wore only simple collars and pouches. Children's magazines publish poems about the adventures of these intrepid messengers, while satirical publications produce gentle caricatures of bureaucrats attempting to organize cats, a metaphor too perfect to ignore. From Paris to London, the Liège experiment becomes a symbol of Belgian eccentricity and charm. The city finds itself receiving curious visitors specifically hoping to glimpse a postal cat in action. Local merchants, quick to capitalize on this interest, begin selling postcards featuring illustrated felines carrying tiny letters. Chocolate shops offer confections shaped like cats with miniature postal bags, while taverns near the post office create special drinks named after the more famous cat couriers. A particular favorite among the public is the story of Mystique, a white cat with one blue and one green eye, who disappears for 3 days before delivering her message to a village 12 kilometers away. Upon investigation, postal officials discover that Mystique had detoured to deliver her kittens in a comfortable barn midway along her route before completing her appointed task. This tale, embellished with each retelling, appears in newspapers as far away as Vienna and Amsterdam. Children write letters addressed to specific postal cats, which postal workers dutifully attach to the appropriate feline's return journey, though whether these messages receive the attention of their intended recipients remains doubtful. One particularly entrepreneurial boy establishes a side business drafting cat post messages for smitten couples, claiming that letters carried by cats possess special romantic powers. Several engagements in Liège that autumn are light-heartedly attributed to his service. Even as practical limitations become increasingly apparent, the cat post captures something essential about its era, that uniquely Victorian blend of technological ambition and whimsical eccentricity. Here is an age when photographic spirits haunt parlors, when gentlemen pursue butterfly collections with scientific seriousness, when public lectures on mesmerism draw crowds in their hundreds. The postal cats of Liège, padding softly between modernity and fancy, embody the charming contradictions of their time. As autumn leaves begin to fall across Liège, postal authorities gradually acknowledge what the cats have known all along, that felines make delightful companions but unreliable civil servants. By October 1870, the official cat post experiment draws to a close, its practical value deemed insufficient to warrant continuation. The 32 remaining postal cats, 5 having permanently deserted their posts for more appealing arrangements, are honorably discharged from service, their tiny collars presented as mementos to the families who housed them. In their official report, the postal administrators strike a tone of reluctant resignation tinged with surprising fondness. The experiment is described as instructive if not practical, and enlightening regarding the limitations of animal messengers. Detailed logs document average delivery times, success rates, and costs of maintenance, all presented with bureaucratic thoroughness belying the whimsical nature of the endeavor. Yet behind these formal assessments lies a wealth of insight. The cat post experiment teaches postal authorities valuable lessons about rural delivery challenges, public engagement with postal services, and the innate limitations of animal messengers. These lessons prove surprisingly applicable to more conventional postal operations. Routes are redrawn based on natural pathways rather than administrative boundaries. Delivery schedules adjust to accommodate seasonal variations. Most importantly, the public's unexpected enthusiasm for the cat post reveals a hunger for connection between urban and rural communities that subsequent postal initiatives will address through more reliable, if less charming, methods. The Liège experiment, while ultimately abandoned, inspires similar animal messenger systems throughout Europe. Carrier pigeon networks, already established for military purposes, expand into limited civilian use. In the mountainous regions of Switzerland and Austria, specially trained postal dogs carry messages and small parcels between isolated alpine communities during winter months, when human messengers cannot safely pass. Even elephants serve postal duties in colonial India, carrying heavier mail loads across difficult terrain. Each of these animal systems improves upon the cat post model, selecting species whose natural behaviors align more predictably with human postal needs. Yet none capture public imagination quite like those first postal cats of Liège. Perhaps because dogs and pigeons seem willing servants, while elephants approach their duties with ponderous dignity, but cats, those independent souls, carry their message pouches with an air suggesting they're doing humans a favor rather than performing a service. Their very unreliability embodies something essentially feline that resonates across cultures and eras. In modern Liège, subtle reminders of this curious chapter persist. A small bronze statue of a cat with a message pouch stands near the old post office site. The annual summer carnival features children dressed as postal cats, parading through streets where their feline predecessors once meandered on unofficial business. A local postal museum displays original documents from the experiment, alongside a reconstructed waterproof message pouch and an artist's rendering of the delivery routes, those optimistic star patterns overlaid with the actual, wandering paths recorded by observant postal workers. Perhaps the most fitting legacy lives in Belgian folklore and bedtime stories, where postal cats still deliver dreams between town and countryside, choosing their own mysterious paths through moonlit fields. Children hear tales of special messages carried by purring couriers, arriving precisely when needed rather than when expected. These stories preserve something essential about the experiment, not its practical failure but its imaginative success, its gentle insistence that efficiency isn't always measured in straight lines or predictable arrivals. The postal cats of Liège remind us that progress takes many forms, some direct as telegraph wires, others meandering as a cat's path home. In our modern world of instant messages and algorithmic efficiency, there's comfort in remembering those 37 cats who, for one Belgian summer, carried the weight of human connection across sunny fields and shaded lanes, stopping whenever a butterfly or sunbeam demanded attention, arriving in their own good time. As you drift towards sleep now, imagine a small grey tabby padding softly along a country path, message pouch swaying gently against velvet fur. There's no hurry in her step, no tension in her whiskers. The message she carries will arrive when it arrives, not a moment sooner. The moonlight bathes her path in silver, while nightbirds call softly from nearby trees. She pauses to listen, then continues her unhurried journey through the gathering darkness. Like this gentle feline messenger, let your thoughts wander without urgency now. Release any need for hurried arrivals or direct paths. Your consciousness may meander like those postal cats of long ago, pausing to investigate interesting shadows, stretching in pools of memory, eventually finding its way to the warm hearth of deep sleep. The message pouch of your waking mind gradually loosens, letters of thought spilling into dreams as your breathing deepens and slows. Rest now, knowing that morning will arrive in its own good time, carrying light across the fields of night, just as surely as those cats once carried words across the countryside of Liège. The desert holds its secrets in whispers of sand, in shadows that stretch and recede across ancient stone. Tonight, we drift back to the banks of the Nile, where one of humanity's most audacious preservation efforts unfolded beneath the watchful gaze of four colossal figures, silent sentinels carved from living rock over 3 millennia ago. This is the story of Abu Simbel, of hubris and ingenuity, of a race against rising waters, and of how modern hands moved mountains to save the dreams of a pharaoh. Long before engineers contemplated the impossible task of relocating an entire temple complex, there was Ramses II, Ramses the Great, pharaoh of the 19th dynasty of Egypt. His reign stretched across 67 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE, a span so vast that many Egyptians knew no other ruler in their lifetimes. His ambitions matched his longevity. While other pharaohs built monuments, Ramses created a landscape of devotion to his own divinity, erecting temples and statues throughout the Nile Valley with unprecedented frequency. At a remote bend in the Nile, near the southern border of his empire in what is now southern Egypt, Ramses ordered the creation of something extraordinary. Carved directly into a sandstone cliff face, the great temple of Abu Simbel announced his power to all who traveled the river. 4 seated figures, each rising 20 meters from base to crown, depict Ramses himself in various aspects of divinity. Their faces, with aquiline noses and enigmatic smiles, stare eastward across the Nile, catching the first light of dawn. These were not merely monuments but political statements, positioned strategically to impress or intimidate those entering Egypt from Nubian territories to the south. Beside this grand facade, a smaller but equally meaningful temple honored Ramses' favorite wife, Queen Nefertari, with statues of her interspersed with more images of the pharaoh. Inside both structures, a series of halls penetrated deep into the cliff, their walls covered with relief carvings showing battle victories, religious ceremonies, and scenes of the royal family making offerings to various gods. Most remarkable was a feature demonstrating Egyptian astronomical precision. Twice each year, on February 22 and October 22, dates that likely corresponded to Ramses' birthday and coronation, the rising sun would penetrate the great temple's entrance, traversing 65 meters of passageways to illuminate statues of gods seated in the innermost sanctuary. For over 3,000 years, these temples stood witness to the rise and fall of civilizations. The Egyptian priesthood eventually faded, Rome rose and declined, Christianity and later Islam swept across North Africa. The sands of the desert, those patient agents of time, gradually buried the great facades until only the uppermost portions of the colossal heads remained visible above the dunes. It wasn't until 1813 that Western eyes rediscovered these wonders. Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, a Swiss explorer traveling through Nubia, noticed the temple tops protruding from the sand. Unable to excavate himself, he shared his discovery with Italian adventurer Giovanni Battista Belzoni, who in 1817 managed to clear enough sand to enter the great temple. Belzoni, overcome by what he found, recorded in his journal, "I was struck with astonishment. I seemed alone in the midst of all that is most sacred in the world." Throughout the 19th century, various European expeditions further excavated and documented the temples. Casts and drawings made their way to museums across Europe, firing the Victorian imagination and contributing to a wave of Egyptomania. Yet the temples themselves remained in their original location, still carved into the living rock, just as Ramses had commanded, the twice-yearly solar alignment continuing its astronomical dance through the millennia. But by the mid-20th century, a new pharaoh of sorts had risen in Egypt with ambitions that would inadvertently threaten Ramses' legacy. Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, dreamed of harnessing the Nile's mercurial waters to generate electricity, control flooding, and irrigate farmland. His vision crystallized in plans for the Aswan High Dam, an engineering marvel that would create a vast reservoir stretching 550 kilometers from southern Egypt into northern Sudan. The benefits would be transformative for modern Egypt: clean hydroelectric power, predictable irrigation, and protection from the Nile's devastating flood cycles. Yet the rising waters of what would become Lake Nasser posed an existential threat to dozens of ancient monuments, including the temples at Abu Simbel. Calculations indicated that the colossal statues would eventually sit beneath more than 60 meters of water, lost to human view and gradually eroded by the lake's currents. The Egyptian government faced an impossible choice: sacrifice irreplaceable cultural heritage for the needs of its living citizens, or compromise a development project vital to the nation's future. As engineers broke ground on the dam in 1960, the countdown began. By 1964, the waters would begin their slow rise, and by 1968, Abu Simbel would vanish beneath the surface if nothing were done. It was at this critical juncture that UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, stepped into the narrative. In what would become its first major international preservation campaign, UNESCO issued an unprecedented global appeal in 1959. The message spread across diplomatic channels, through newspapers and radio broadcasts, reaching governments, universities, and cultural institutions worldwide. Help save the treasures of ancient Nubia before they disappear forever. The response was remarkable in both its scope and sentiment. Nations locked in Cold War antagonism found common ground in cultural preservation. A total of 50 countries eventually contributed to the rescue fund, with particularly significant donations from the United States, Italy, West Germany, France, and even the United Arab Republic, Egypt itself, despite its limited resources. School children mailed coins collected in classrooms from Tokyo to Toronto. Wealthy philanthropists wrote substantial checks. Museums organized fundraising exhibitions. By 1963, approximately 42 million had been raised, an immense sum for cultural heritage at that time. With funding secured and time running short, attention turned to the monumental question, how does one move a temple carved from living rock? Initial proposals ranged from the fanciful to the seemingly impossible. Some suggested creating a massive cofferdam around the site, effectively creating an island that would remain above the rising reservoir. Others proposed encasing the temples in transparent underwater structures, allowing future visitors to view them beneath the surface of Lake Nasser. Yet these approaches presented insurmountable technical challenges, or would have compromised the long-term preservation of the monuments. The solution that eventually emerged was both audacious and precise. The temples would be completely disassembled, moved to higher ground, and reassembled in exactly the same configuration. The Italian firm Imprigilo, leading an international consortium of construction companies, developed a plan that would require cutting the temples into manageable blocks, lifting them to safety, and reconstructing them in a manner that preserved their appearance and astronomical alignment, while hiding all evidence of the modern intervention. Work began in November 1963, with the rising waters of the partially completed dam already beginning their slow creep upstream. Engineers first constructed a temporary cofferdam to hold back the Nile while work proceeded. Then came the painstaking documentation. Every centimeter of the temple facades, interiors, and surrounding cliff was photographed, measured, and mapped using the most advanced techniques available. Photogrammetry created precise three-dimensional models. Archaeologists numbered each section according to a complex grid system that would guide later reassembly. The most delicate phase followed, the cutting. Special saws with diamond-tipped blades sliced through the ancient sandstone, dividing the monolithic structures into blocks averaging 20 tons each. Workers carefully positioned these cuts to follow natural strata in the rock where possible, minimizing damage to carved surfaces. Where relief carvings or painted surfaces would be bisected, conservators applied protective coatings to prevent crumbling or flaking during the move. The precision required was extraordinary. Each block needed to fit perfectly with its neighbors when reassembled, despite the natural variations in the stone. Engineers developed a system of reference points, marking invisible connection points with metal pins that would later guide reassembly. Some blocks contained sections of multiple carved figures, perhaps a pharaoh's hand on one side and the wing of a divine falcon on another, requiring cuts that navigated three-dimensional space with submarine-like precision. As each massive stone block was freed from the cliff face, a specialized lifting apparatus hoisted it from its 3 millennia resting place. Picture the scene. A colossal head of Ramses, weighing over 30 tons, suspended briefly in mid-air against the backdrop of the Nubian sky. A pharaoh's visage floating above the desert floor before being gently lowered onto a waiting transport vehicle. The blocks then traveled along a purpose-built road to a storage area safe from the rising waters, where they awaited their second life. Inside the hollowed temples, the atmosphere grew increasingly surreal. Chambers, once dark and mysterious, now opened to the desert light, as their outer walls disappeared block by block. Voices echoed differently in these transitional spaces, neither fully ancient temple nor modern construction site. Workers moved through passageways where priests had once walked, now bisected by scaffolding and temporary supports. The sacred spaces became a three-dimensional puzzle being slowly disassembled under the pressure of the approaching waters and the ticking clock of the dam's completion schedule. By 1966, the cutting phase was complete. In total, 136 blocks had been removed from the Great Temple and 235 from the smaller Temple of Nefertari. The largest weighed 45 tons, the smallest just a few hundred kilograms. Each bore its unique identification number, a modern annotation on ancient stone. The dismantled temples now waited in ordered rows under temporary shelters, like scattered pieces of a giant's construction set. Meanwhile, preparation of the new site had begun 65 meters above the original location and 200 meters back from the shoreline of the future reservoir. Here, engineers faced another extraordinary challenge: recreating the environment of the original temples, including the cliff face into which they had been carved. The solution was a feat of modern construction technology. Two massive concrete domes, reinforced with steel, would create artificial hills into which the temples would be reassembled. The reconstruction phase began with the careful positioning of the rear chambers of each temple within the concrete domes. Working from the inside outward, the reverse of the cutting sequence, workers guided each block back into position using the reference markers established during dismantling. Special epoxy resins bonded the stones together, creating joints nearly invisible to the naked eye. Where necessary, conservators delicately retouched damaged surfaces, always adhering to the principle of minimal intervention. As the reassembly progressed outward toward the facades, engineers maintained precise alignment with the original astronomical orientation. The twice-yearly solar phenomenon, where sunlight penetrates to the innermost sanctuary on Ramses' birthday and coronation day, had to be preserved exactly. Surveyors and astronomers worked together to ensure that the temple's new position would maintain this alignment, despite being in a different location relative to the surrounding landscape. The great colossi gradually took shape once more, their serene faces emerging from the ordered chaos of construction. Where the original temple had been carved into natural rock, the reconstruction nestled within its concrete dome, the modern materials entirely hidden from view. From the outside, visitors would see only what Ramses had intended, massive figures emerging from what appeared to be a natural cliff face. The final phase of reconstruction addressed the surrounding landscape. The concrete domes were covered with rubble and sand to mimic the appearance of a natural formation. Local rock was brought in to recreate the cliff face. Even the color and texture of the surrounding sand was considered, with materials selected to match the original site. Landscapers planted native vegetation in patterns that would naturally occur in the desert environment, creating an ecological continuity with the surrounding area. On September 22, 1968, just 4 months before the waters of Lake Nasser would have covered the original site, the rescued temples of Abu Simbel were officially inaugurated in their new location. To the visitor approaching by boat across the waters of the new reservoir, the illusion was complete. The temples appeared to have always been there, still gazing out across the water as they had for 3 millennia, their inner secrets and solar alignment preserved. The success of the Abu Simbel project rippled far beyond the shores of Lake Nasser, creating enduring waves in how humanity approaches cultural heritage preservation. UNESCO's campaign had demonstrated something profound, that certain monuments transcend national boundaries to become the shared inheritance of all humanity. This philosophy would later crystallize in the 1972 World Heritage Convention, establishing formal mechanisms for identifying and protecting sites of outstanding universal value. Abu Simbel, that monumental puzzle solved through international cooperation, had helped birth a new era of global conservation ethics. The preservation techniques pioneered at Abu Simbel have since informed countless other rescue operations. When Venice faced rising waters, when Angkor Wat suffered from environmental degradation, when earthquake-damaged temples in Nepal needed reconstruction, engineers and conservators drew upon lessons learned beside the Nile. The meticulous documentation methods, the careful dismantling procedures, the invisible reassembly techniques, all became part of the conservators' standard toolkit. Abu Simbel itself has evolved in its new life. The temple complex now stands at the heart of a thriving tourism ecosystem, with thousands of visitors arriving daily by air and boat to witness Ramses' achievement and its modern resurrection. Hotels have sprung up nearby, offering rooms with views of the colossal statues illuminated at night. Guides lead groups through the inner chambers, explaining both the ancient symbolism and the engineering marvel of the temple's relocation. Each February and October, hundreds gather before dawn to witness the solar alignment, when light still pierces the inner sanctuary just as Ramses designed, a testament to the precision of both ancient creators and modern rescuers. Perhaps most poignantly, Abu Simbel has become a place where visitors contemplate not just ancient history but our modern relationship with it. The rescued temples embody questions increasingly relevant in our era of climate change and development pressure. What deserves preservation? At what cost? Who decides? The fact that we can now stand before these colossal figures, that we can still witness the twice-yearly solar miracle, suggests one possible answer: that some achievements so perfectly express human creativity and cosmic connection that they merit extraordinary efforts to ensure their continuation. For astronomers and stargazers, Abu Simbel holds special significance. The precision with which both ancient Egyptians and modern engineers maintained the solar alignment speaks to humanity's enduring fascination with celestial patterns. Today, visitors often extend their temple tours with nighttime star watching in the surrounding desert, where minimal light pollution offers pristine views of the same sky Ramses' astronomers studied. Tour companies offer astronomical heritage packages combining temple visits with guided stargazing, drawing connections between ancient Egyptian celestial knowledge and our contemporary understanding of the cosmos. The waters of Lake Nasser now lap peacefully against shores not far from the temple complex, the reservoir having filled completely by 1,976 fish swim where desert once stretched. The local climate has subtly shifted, with slightly higher humidity and occasional morning mists that would have been unknown in Ramses' time. Yet the colossal figures remain, their expressions unchanged, their gaze still directed eastward across waters that, while not the flowing Nile of their original design, continue the ancient relationship between stone and water, between human creation and natural force. At night, when the tourists have departed and the spotlights are dimmed, Abu Simbel returns to a silence reminiscent of its centuries buried beneath desert sands. The stars wheel overhead, reflected in the dark waters of the reservoir. Perhaps in these quiet hours, the boundary between original and reconstruction, between ancient and modern, grows less distinct. The rescued temples become simply temples again, their sandstone absorbing the cool night air, their carved reliefs holding stories in tactile form, waiting for morning light to bring them once more to life. As our own journey through this remarkable rescue draws to a close, imagine standing before the great colossi in the gentle light of dusk. The day's heat gradually dissipates. Far below, tiny waves lap against the shoreline in slow, rhythmic succession. The massive faces, with their enigmatic smiles, emerge from shadow into the last golden light. These are the same expressions that have greeted countless dawns over 3 millennia, that witnessed the fall of pharaohs and the rise of new powers, that disappeared beneath sand only to be revealed again, that were cut into pieces and made whole once more. Let your thoughts drift now with the slow-moving waters of Lake Nasser, with the gradual shifting of stars above the desert horizon. Feel the weight of your body growing heavier, just as the stone blocks of Abu Simbel settled into their new foundations. Your breathing deepens, becomes more regular, like the patient work of those who rescued these monuments one careful piece at a time. There is no need to hurry now, no rising waters threatening ancient treasures, no race against time. The temples have been saved, their future secured through human ingenuity and cooperation. As sleep approaches, carry with you this image of preservation, of careful hands moving ancient stone to safety, of sunlight still finding its path to illuminate a pharaoh's face after all these centuries. Rest in the knowledge that some things endure beyond their expected time through our collective care. Like Abu Simbel itself, may you rise renewed in the morning light, reborn without visible seams, your dreams safely preserved through the night.